mid-1990s, a group of touring professionals were on a practice range in Texas, and one of them stopped hitting balls to watch an old man at the far end. The old man was in his 60s. He was wearing mismatched clothes, a turtleneck in the heat, and he had a swing that looked wrong in every way a golf swing can look wrong. His feet were too far apart. His arms were locked out straight. He gripped the club in his palms instead of his fingers, which is the first thing every instructor in the world tells you not to do. And he stood over the ball with the club head set nearly a foot behind it, which is not a thing anybody does. Then he hit a ball, and then he hit another one, and the second ball hit the first one in the air. The professional watching was Tiger Woods, and he said, years later, that there were only 2 golfers in history who ever truly owned their swing, who could stand over a shot and know with certainty exactly what the ball was going to do. One was Ben Hogan. The other was the man on the end of that range. His name was Moe Norman. He never won a major. He never really competed on the PGA Tour. Most golf fans have never heard of him. And a substantial number of the greatest players who ever lived believed he struck a golf ball better than anyone who has ever played the game. This is the story of how that's possible. How a man can be the best in the world at the single hardest skill in his sport and spend most of his life broke, sleeping in his car and hustling small-town tournaments in Canada for a few $100s. Because the answer isn't that golf failed to notice him. Golf noticed. That's what makes it worse. He was born Moe Norman in Kitchener, Ontario in 1929 into a working-class family with no connection to golf whatsoever. His father sold shoes. Golf, at that time and in that place, was a game for people with money and club memberships, and the Normans had neither. There's an incident from his childhood that the story always includes, and it deserves care rather than drama. As a young boy, he was in a sledding accident and was struck by a car. He was not seriously injured in any lasting physical sense, and he went on to have extraordinary physical coordination. But some who knew him believed it marked a change in him, and for the rest of his life, Moe displayed patterns of behaviour that today would very likely be recognised as being on the autism spectrum, though he was never formally diagnosed in an era that had no framework for it. What that meant, practically, is that Moe was different in ways that made people uncomfortable. He spoke in rapid bursts, often repeating phrases. He avoided eye contact. He struggled enormously in social settings, at dinners, in interviews, in the clubhouse. He had intense, narrow, absolute focus on the thing he cared about, and the thing he cared about was hitting a golf ball. He started as a caddy, which was the only way a boy like him got onto a course, and then he began doing something that nobody in golf really does, which is practicing with the obsessive, unlimited, joyful repetition of someone who genuinely does not want to be doing anything else. The numbers attached to his practice are the kind that sound exaggerated until you hear them from multiple sources. 800 balls a day, 1,000, hitting until his hands bled, then wrapping them and continuing, not for a season, for decades. By his own estimate, he hit several million golf balls in his life. And crucially, he practiced differently. Most players practice a swing. Moe was practicing a delivery. His entire method was built around one idea, which was to eliminate every variable that could put the club face in a different place at impact. That's why the swing looked so strange. Every single thing that looked wrong about it was a deliberate simplification. The wide stance was for stability. The straight arms and the club set far behind the ball created what he called a single plane, where the club, the arms and the shoulders were as close as possible to one straight line from address all the way through impact, so there was less to time and less to go wrong. The palm grip, which coaches hate because it reduces feel, also reduces manipulation, and Moe did not want feel. He wanted a mechanism. Conventional golf instruction of that era taught a two-plane swing, where the club travels on one path going back and a different one coming down, and the player has to time the transition. It produces beautiful, flowing swings, and it requires constant maintenance, which is why professionals are forever losing their swing. Moe built something with fewer moving parts, and the result was a repeatability that people who saw it describe in almost disbelieving terms. Here's what that repeatability actually looked like. He set 50 course records across his career. He recorded 17 holes in one. He shot 59 twice, at a time when a 59 was essentially unheard of. He won the Canadian Amateur in 1955 and again in 1956. But the records aren't really the thing. The thing is the demonstrations, because they're the part that's hard to explain away. He would tee up a ball in front of a 100-yard marker and hit it so the ball landed and stopped against the post. Not near it, against it. Then he'd do it again. He'd hit balls off the deck, one after another, and they'd land in a cluster you could cover with a blanket. He would ask a spectator to name a shot, high fade, low draw, anything, and produce it immediately. He'd hit balls off a Coke bottle. He'd hit them off the toe of his shoe. In one demonstration that multiple people witnessed, he hit shots into a fairway where a caddy stood holding a shag bag, and the caddy caught them. And there's the one that professionals talk about most, which is that he could aim at a distant flag and hit it, not the green, the actual flag stick, with a frequency that made people stop treating it as luck. Sam Snead played with him. Lee Trevino called him one of the greatest strikers he'd ever seen. Vijay Singh, who is himself one of the most obsessive practicers in the history of the sport, went to watch him. Tiger's assessment we already have. These are not sentimental endorsements from people being kind about an eccentric. These are the best ball strikers of their generations, describing someone they considered better than them at the specific thing they had devoted their lives to. It's worth slowing down on the mechanics, because if you only hear he had a weird swing that worked, you miss why serious coaches now teach it. Think about what actually has to happen for a golf shot to be good. The club face has to arrive at the ball travelling in the right direction, at the right angle, with the face pointing the right way, at speed. That's 4 variables that all have to be correct simultaneously, in about a fifth of a second, from a position where you cannot see the club head. The conventional swing solves this with timing. The club goes back on one plane, transitions, comes down on another, and the player's hands rotate through impact to square the face. When it's right, it's the most beautiful motion in sport. But it's a sequence of compensations, and compensations have to be maintained. That's why a professional can wake up one morning and simply not have it, and why tour players spend their lives with swing coaches. Moe's answer was to remove the compensations rather than to perfect them. Setting the club a foot behind the ball at address wasn't an eccentricity. It put the club where it would actually be travelling at impact, so the takeaway started from the delivery position instead of having to find it. The straight arms and upright posture put the shaft, the arms and the shoulder line closer to a single plane, so the club went back and came down on roughly the same path. The palm grip locked the wrists against unwanted rotation. The wide stance killed lateral movement. Every one of those choices trades feel and beauty for repeatability. A tour pro with a classic swing can do things Moe couldn't. Shape shots with subtle hand action, produce spin variations, play recovery shots from impossible positions. Moe gave that up and got, in exchange, a machine. And he described it in exactly those terms. He talked about the swing as something you should be able to do without thinking. And he was contemptuous of the idea that a golfer should be managing positions mid-swing. He'd say he was never nervous over a shot because there was nothing to be nervous about. He knew where the ball was going. That's a genuinely radical claim. And the reason people believed it is that they watched him do it for hours without deviation. There's a detail from those practice sessions that I think tells you more than any statistic. When Moe hit balls, the divots were identical. Same size, same depth, same shape, in a neat row. Range staff talked about it. You can watch footage of a professional's practice area and see variation. Moe's looked like it had been done by a machine tool. Now, the other half of his career that gets skipped, which is what he actually achieved in Canada. Because the framing of "he never made it" is only true if you define making it as the PGA Tour. Moe won something in the region of 55 professional tournaments in Canada. He won the Canadian PGA Championship. He was, for the better part of 2 decades, simply the best player in the country. And the Canadian Tour in that era was not a soft field. It was full of hard, capable professionals playing for money they needed. His 2 Canadian amateur titles in 1955 and 1956 are the ones that should have opened every door. Winning that back-to-back marked him as the outstanding amateur in the country, and it earned him invitations to the Masters. And what happened at Augusta is the hinge of the entire story. The accounts differ in detail, which is normal for something that happened 70 years ago to a man who didn't give many straight interviews, but the core is consistent. Moe arrived at the most formal, most tradition-bound tournament in golf, a place with an unwritten code about how you dress, how you behave, how long you take, and how you speak to people. And he was, in every one of those dimensions, not what Augusta expected. He played, and by some accounts played well in stretches, and then, during a practice round, he was given advice by a well-known professional about his swing. And Moe being Moe, he went to the range and hit balls until his hands were bleeding, trying to do what he'd been told. He wasn't being stubborn, he was being obedient, in the most literal and painful way, to people he thought knew better. And then he withdrew and drove home. That's the sentence that ends the mainstream chapter of his career. Not a missed cut, not an injury. He left because the environment made him feel like something to be corrected. There's a version of this story where that's a failure of nerve. I don't think it is. I think it's what happens when you take a person whose entire relationship with the world is regulated by one perfectly controlled activity, and you tell him that the way he does that activity is wrong and shameful. You haven't criticised his golf swing, you've removed the flaw. So why isn't he a household name? And here is where the story turns, and where it stops being about golf. Moe Norman went to the PGA Tour. He qualified, he played, and it did not work. And the reasons had almost nothing to do with his ability to hit a golf ball. The first problem was speed. Moe played fast, genuinely unusually fast. He would walk to his ball, take almost no time over it, and hit. Because for him, there was nothing to deliberate about. The swing was the same every time, so why stand there? Tour golf did not want that. He was told to slow down, and being told to change the rhythm that his entire method depended on was, for Moe, not a minor adjustment. The second problem was money. He had none. He travelled to tournaments with barely enough to get there, slept in his car, and could not afford to miss cuts. That is an enormous psychological weight that wealthy amateurs and sponsored players simply never carry. But the third problem is the one that actually ended it, and it's the ugly one. Moe did not behave the way tour professionals were expected to behave. He didn't do the dinners. He didn't do the interviews smoothly. He'd show up in bright, mismatched clothing. He'd talk in rapid loops to himself. He'd do trick shots for the crowd, because the crowd loved it, and because entertaining people was one of the few social interactions that made sense to him. And the golf establishment of the 1950s found him embarrassing. There are accounts, repeated by people close to him, of officials and senior players taking him aside and telling him he was making a fool of himself, telling him he was an embarrassment to the game, telling him to dress properly, act properly, and stop the theatrics. Think about what that means to a man who is almost certainly autistic, in an era with no vocabulary for that, who has found the one place on earth where he is not merely competent, but supreme, and who is now being told that the way he exists in that place is shameful. He played in the Masters, and the story that follows him from that period is that during a practice round, or a competitive round, he was so worried about the reaction to how he played and how long he took, that the pressure became unbearable. And then he did the thing that defines the rest of his life. He left. He walked away from the tour, went back to Canada, and spent the following decades playing the Canadian circuit, small professional events, exhibitions and matches. He won an enormous number of them. He was, by a distance, the best player at that level in the country for years, and he made almost no money doing it. This is the part that's genuinely hard to sit with. For roughly 30 years, one of the greatest ball strikers in the history of the sport was living in cheap motels, sometimes sleeping in his car, driving between small tournaments, giving demonstrations for petrol money, and hitting balls on ranges for anyone who wanted to watch. He would take a cash prize and give it away. He'd hand money to strangers who looked like they needed it. He bought clubs for kids. He had no interest in accumulating anything, which is part of why he never had anything. He was, by most accounts, not unhappy. That's the complicated part of the story that a simpler telling would leave out. Moe was not a tragic figure, sitting in a room grieving what he'd lost. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do, every day, which was hitting golf balls in front of people who appreciated it, in a country where he was left alone. But he was also, quite obviously, someone whose gift was never allowed to meet the stage it deserved, and he knew it. In later interviews, he spoke about the way he'd been treated, and the hurt is right there. And it's worth being specific about what those decades actually looked like, because he played in Canada flattens something quite extraordinary. Moe's working life was a circuit of small tournaments, corporate outings, club exhibitions and clinics. He'd drive himself between them, often long distances, and he'd arrive and do the thing he did. A clinic with Moe Norman wasn't a lesson in the usual sense. It was a demonstration, with commentary, delivered in his rapid staccato, while he hit shot after shot without missing. People who attended them describe a strange emotional experience. There's the comedy at the start, because he looked odd and talked oddly, and the audience didn't know what they were about to see. Then there's the moment the first shots land, and the room reorganizes itself around the realization that this man is not a novelty act. He'd hit driver after driver, and they'd land in the same place. He'd take requests. He'd narrate what he was doing in fragments, repeating phrases, and he was, by every account, completely happy while doing it. This was the one context in his life where he was unambiguously in command. And then he'd take whatever he'd been paid and frequently give a chunk of it away before he left town. The generosity stories are numerous enough that they're clearly not embroidery. He handed cash to people who looked like they needed it. He'd buy meals for strangers. He bought equipment for young players. He'd win a tournament and give the prize money to the person who finished second if he thought they needed it more. He also, famously, didn't accumulate. He had no house for long stretches. He drove old cars, wore whatever was to hand, and lived out of motels. Some of that was poverty. A lot of it was simply that possessions did not interest him. He wanted to hit golf balls, be left alone, and be around people who liked watching. That's the part that resists the tragic framing. He wasn't sitting in the dark. His life, on its own terms, contained a great deal of what he actually wanted. What he was denied was recognition and security, and those were denied by an institution that had every opportunity to give them. There's one more strand worth pulling, which is how his reputation survived at all. It survived by word of mouth among professionals. Players who encountered him told other players. Coaches who saw him talked about him. And, in an era before video was everywhere, that meant Moe existed mainly as a rumour in the golf world, a thing you were told about by someone who swore they'd seen it, which is exactly the kind of story that usually gets exaggerated into myth and then dismissed. Except in his case, when film did eventually surface, and when serious analysts started studying it frame by frame, it held up. The rumour was accurate. That almost never happens. Now the part of the story that redeems it slightly. As the years went on, Moe's reputation grew underground. Players talked. Coaches started studying film of the swing that everyone had once laughed at. And the analysis kept arriving at the same conclusion, which is that Moe's method wasn't a quirk that he succeeded despite. It was a genuinely coherent and arguably superior mechanical solution. The single plane swing became a taught methodology. Instructors built entire teaching systems on it. The essential insight, which is that reducing variables beats maximizing elegance, became something biomechanics research supported. And in 1995, something happened that changed his last years. Titleist, through their chairman Wally Uline, established an arrangement to pay Moe a monthly stipend for the rest of his life. Not for endorsement work, not for appearances. Essentially, in recognition of what he had contributed to the game and how little he had received for it. He was in his mid-60s. It was the first financial security he had ever had. He was inducted into the Canadian Golf Hall of Fame. He was celebrated, finally, publicly, by the people who mattered. And in the last decade of his life, he had money, recognition, and a stream of people who came to watch him hit balls specifically because they knew what they were looking at. He died in 2004. There's a coda worth adding, because it says something about how the game finally understood him. In his later years, when people had started to treat him as a figure of real significance rather than a curiosity, he was asked repeatedly to explain himself. Why the grip? Why the stance? Why he never went back to the tour? And the answers he gave were almost always about the same thing, which was certainty. He talked about knowing where the ball was going before he hit it, knowing he didn't have to think. He described other golfers as hoping and himself as knowing. And he did not say it as a boast, he said it as a description of a different activity. Whether or not that's literally true, it explains everything about the way he lived. A man who has found certainty in one narrow place will organize his entire existence around protecting access to that place. He'll refuse money that comes with conditions. He'll leave a tournament that makes the certainty feel fragile. He'll practice past the point of injury because the practice is not preparation for anything, it is the thing itself. Golf treated that as a failure of ambition. It's at least as reasonable to read it as somebody knowing exactly what he valued and declining to trade it. So what's the actual takeaway from Moe Norman, beyond the sadness? I think it's this. Golf, more than almost any sport, has always claimed to be a meritocracy. The ball doesn't know who you are. The scorecard doesn't care about your accent or your clothes. That's the whole romance of it. And Moe Norman is the most complete refutation of that claim the sport has ever produced. Because he was, by the assessment of the best players alive, the finest striker of a golf ball on earth. And the sport had no place for him. Not because he couldn't play, because he was odd and poor and fast and didn't perform being a professional correctly. The scorecard didn't reject him, the clubhouse did. And there's a second lesson that's more useful and less bitter, which is about the swing itself. Every expert who watched Moe in the 1950s knew that grip was wrong, that stance was wrong, that setup was wrong. They were certain, and they were unanimous, and they were looking directly at a man producing better results than any of them. The consensus wasn't stupid. It was just describing what most people should do, and mistaking that for what everyone must do. The orthodoxy was a good average, and Moe was not an average. He spent his life being told to fix a swing that worked by people who could not do what he did. So the next time you see somebody doing something unconventional and getting results, it's worth remembering the old man at the end of the range in his mismatched clothes, being watched by the best player in the world, hitting one ball into another in mid-air. Nobody would sign him. Everybody wanted to watch him. That gap is the whole story.